Welcome to this introduction video to your Virtual Intercultural Mentoring Program, Part 3, Cultural Influences on Communication. In this video, we will approach the phenomena of communication by first looking at concepts and definitions of communication, followed by considering cultural influences on verbal, paraverbal and non-verbal communication styles. Let's start with concepts and definitions of communication. The term communication comes from the Latin word communicare, which means to share, to impart, to make common, to participate, to connect. Communication means that we share information with others, and we do so by speaking, writing, body language or other signals. The transmission model of communication shows that during an interaction process, a sender encodes and sends a message, and a receiver receives, decodes, and interprets the message. Messages can be transmitted via different channels like words or gestures. And different factors, so-called noise, which could for example be different code systems or simply a loud surrounding, can disturb this process. Communication is divided into verbal communication, which is everything you say with words, written or spoken. Paraverbal communication, which is everything you add with your voice, like volume, tone, pitch and pacing. And nonverbal communication, which is everything you communicate with your body, including facial expression, gestures, eye contact, touch, body postures, or spatial and temporal coordination. In a study on information flow, Konia and Barber found out to which percentage verbal, paraverbal and nonverbal signals contribute to the information flow in conversations. So, what do you think? Can you imagine that on average only 7% of information is transferred by words, but 38% by paraverbal signals of your voice and 55% by nonverbal signals of your body language? This study shows the great relevance of para and nonverbal signals in communication processes. Moreover, para and nonverbal signals are sent and interpreted mostly subconsciously. Very often, we are not aware of our facial expression or the sound of our voice when saying something. But for our communication partners, these signals play a major role. Have you ever heard anybody say, "It's not what you said, but how you said it"? Communication can be divided into content messages and relationship messages. Content messages are on information, tasks, details and facts. They are predominantly transmitted verbally and mostly consciously. Relationship messages are on interpersonal relationships and emotions. They are predominantly transmitted through non- and paraverbal signals, which are mostly sent and received subconsciously. Since it is so important to care for our social relationships, these facts definitely show the importance of paying attention to our non- and paraverbal expressions. Communication is a highly complex cognitive process. Our brain is simultaneously coding and decoding, sending and receiving, deciding on and interpreting verbal, paraverbal and non-verbal messages. And most of this happens subconsciously. It is important to be aware of the complexity of these processes and to pay more attention to them, since they are significantly influencing our lives. Additionally, we should be aware that we are communicating all the time. Watzlawick, a very famous Austrian-American philosopher and communication theorist, said, "We cannot not communicate. As soon as two humans are in the same room, they communicate. Even if you are sitting on a bus, listening to music with your headphones, looking out of the window, by your mere appearance, your body posture, and your facial expressions, you are communicating and other people read these signals. And even when you are really alone, you are constantly communicating with yourself by thoughts and physical experiences." The transaction model of communication emphasizes the influence of external factors on our communication. It distinguishes 5 so-called noises: physical, psychological, social, cultural, and relational noise. Physical noises are factors like poor audio quality in virtual meetings or a really loud construction site next to your office. Psychological noise could, for example, be the unwillingness to listen out of disinterest or tiredness. Social noise might be different conceptions of social roles and their stated or unstated norms. For example, if a student is approaching a professor in a communication style that is more suitable for a friend. Relational noise relates to the interpersonal history and type of relationship you have with your communication partner. You communicate differently with someone you just met versus somebody you've known for a long time. And cultural noise refers to the influence of culture on your communicative behavior. All these factors contribute to the co-creation of meaning during interactions. And as we can see easily, these aspects can differ greatly between communication partners. After talking about these basics of communication, we want to focus on one of these so-called noises, the influence of culture on our communication. Every culture follows internal communication rules. These rules define, for example, which communicative behavior is polite or impolite, and how to behave in certain situations. Since different cultures can have quite different concepts, cultural differences in communication can be a source of misunderstandings and even accidental insults. It is important to be aware that culture influences all levels of communication: verbal, paraverbal, and nonverbal levels. Let's have a closer look at some important aspects. We will start with the influence of culture on verbal communication. Even though many cultural factors influence what we say and how we say it, we will concentrate on two major components: the cultural dimension of high context versus low context, and secondly, the linguistic rules of languages. Hall locates national cultures on a continuum from high context to low context. In low context cultures like Germany or Scandinavian countries, many things are expressed verbally, explicit and direct. Most topics are addressed precisely and effectively. People have an honest, even if it hurts, attitude to give others a fair chance to learn from mistakes. According to this, people even submit disagreement and critique quite openly. In high context cultures, verbal messages are more implicit and indirect. One wouldn't get straight to the point but embellish it. In many cases, harmony is more important than honesty. According to this, disagreement and critique are mostly submitted indirectly or non-verbally. You can probably imagine that these different understandings of what is appropriate to say can lead to situations in which people feel insulted. Müller-Jacquier wrote a groundbreaking paper about the linguistic awareness of cultures. He states that all languages have well-established rules how to express politeness, excitement, disagreement, and so on. The problem is, these rules are sometimes quite different or even opposed. While, for example, in the US American or Spanish language, people frequently interrupt their conversation partner out of excitement, in the German language area, interruptions are seen as impolite or marker for dissent. Opposed to this, French-speaking people practice consensual interruptions. And another example is turn-taking in conversations. If you want to start speaking, in German language areas, you should wait until your communication partner finished his/her contribution. But in French-speaking countries, you might wait for a long time, since contributions are often overlapping and it is not necessary to wait for a break. Just jump in. Also, the use of linguistic politeness markers differs from language to language. While British English speakers use the term please a lot, German speakers use specific grammar forms like the subjunctive more frequently. Thus, people might perceive their communication partners as impolite since their linguistic expectations are not met. Additionally, the meaning of internationalisms can be very different. If you tell your friend from class, please bring your concept to the meeting, and they are German speakers, you will probably see a whole action plan. If they are French speakers, you might get some keywords as base for a brainstorming. Also, the meaning of terms like Sunday or school varies between languages. Those terms are culturally loaded. If you are asked, "We are going to the cinema on Sunday night, do you want to come by?" you should be aware that the intention behind invitations or promises varies between different languages. While this would be a fixed invitation in the German language area, in other languages it might be uttered simply to include you politely into the conversation. Last but not least, there are differences in what is appropriate to say in formal and informal talk. Yes, even what is considered as formal or informal. While in German-speaking countries, politics are a common topic in informal talks, in many other countries people would not appreciate that. Instead, talking about the family could be highly appreciated. Similarly, therapeutic issues might be debated in the margins of formal talk in the US-American area, while in German-speaking countries, people consider these issues as very intimate and only to be discussed with close friends. Now let's have a look at some examples of cultural influences on paraverbal communication. Our first example is volume. There are huge cultural differences regarding the acceptance and perception of surrounding sounds, the acoustic level in public places, and volume in direct interactions. For example, people from Spanish, Italian, or Arabic-speaking areas are often perceived as speaking loudly if you are looking through a pair of German cultural glasses. The problem is that speaking too loudly is also seen as impolite. Additionally, there are differences in the cultural meaning when someone is raising their voice. While in the first mentioned cultures you express your interest, emotional involvement, or compassion by raising your voice, in other cultures, raising their voice is interpreted as lack of self-control or anger, a rather negative meaning. Also, the speed, the use of pauses, and silence varies between languages. While, for example, in Scandinavian countries, people frequently take more time to think about and utter their contributions, people speaking Romance languages speak faster and pauses are generally shorter. Let's jump to cultural influences on nonverbal communication. One nonverbal expression that varies greatly between different cultures is the use of gestures. Gestures are used to orchestrate speech. The famous American anthropologist Edward Sapir claimed in 1949 that gestures are the secret code of a cultural group that is written nowhere, known by none, and understood by all. This means that all cultures have specific gestures with very specific meanings. And these meanings can vary greatly between cultures. While, for example, pointing at someone is used as references in some cultures, it is an insult in most parts of the world. Additionally, some cultures tend to communicate with gestures more prominently than others. This includes the number of gestures used in daily conversations, their frequency, and their spatial intensity. Studies show, for example, that Neapolitans are much richer in gestures compared to speakers in Central England. Eye contact is another nonverbal aspect that is very much culturally influenced. In many Western cultures, for example the United States, direct eye contact is considered as necessary in interpersonal communication. Direct eye contact is a signal of active listening, confidence, trust, honesty, and personal interest. The same amount of eye contact would be considered as rude, challenging, disrespectful, staring, or even threatening in many other cultures. In Japan, for example, it is more appropriate to avoid constant eye contact and to look at someone's chin or mouth when speaking. Culture-specific rules on eye contact are generally very much interconnected with codes of politeness, hierarchy, respect, and demographic categories like age and gender. In the use of facial expression, amount and occasion vary greatly between cultures. In some cultures, negative feelings like anger may be displayed in facial expression, while in other cultures, such a display would be perceived as way too offensive or even rude. Additionally, neutral facial expressions are favored in some cultures, while rich facial expressions represent a large part of communicative signals in other cultures. Proxemics is the study of personal space. It can be seen as invisible, three-dimensional bubble surrounding a person which allows that person to regulate his or her interactions with the outside world. In 1959, Hall defined 4 dimensions of personal space, based on the level of intimacy between the interacting people. Intimate distance, which is reserved for close family members or your partner, meaning people you share close physical contact with. Personal distance, which is reserved for close friends or family members you feel very comfortable with. Social distance, which is reserved, for example, for colleagues. And the public distance, which is the distance you keep to people you don't know. But the size of these spaces varies in different cultures. Beaulieu found out that Anglo-Saxons use the largest zone of personal space, followed by Asians, then Caucasians. Mediterraneans and Latin Americans use the shortest distances. We hope that these examples could show that there are huge differences in verbal, paraverbal and non-verbal communication between different cultures. Being aware of these differences, you can sometimes avoid misinterpretation. But please keep in mind, our behavior is not only influenced by culture. Human behavior has universal human aspects, cultural influences and individual tones. Even though culture is heavily influential in communication processes, we have to open our eyes and hearts to the individual person we are communicating with. We wish you joyful intercultural encounters.